All right, let's start. Number 8, the meat grinder of Rzhev. Between January 1942 and March 1943, Soviet forces launched 16 months of near-continuous assaults against a German salient centered on the city of Rzhev, 230 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The battles that followed produced losses so catastrophic, so staggering in their human cost, that Stalin personally ensured they were scrubbed from the official record. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the Soviet operations. The Germans called the salient a cornerstone. The men who fought there called it something else entirely. By the spring of 1942, the Rzhev salient represented one of the most heavily fortified positions on the Eastern Front, held by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's Army Group Center against 4 separate Soviet offensive operations. Soviet military doctrine at the time demanded relentless pressure, wave after wave of infantry sent forward, regardless of what the previous wave had encountered. The logic was industrial. The results were savage. Divisions were fed into the assault and consumed, replaced, and consumed again across 16 unbroken months of combat in forests, mud, and frozen ground. Estimates of Soviet dead at Rzhev range from 1.1 million to over 2 million, depending on which archives are consulted and how broadly the campaign boundaries are drawn. Those numbers made the battle politically indefensible. Zhukov, whom Stalin needed as a symbol of Soviet competence, had presided over some of the most catastrophic assaults of the entire war, so the battles were reclassified, omitted, compressed into footnotes. Veterans who survived were forbidden from discussing what they had witnessed. The phrase meat grinder never appeared in any state publication. Soviet military historians writing through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s produced exhaustive accounts of the Eastern Front that allocated Rzhev a handful of paragraphs at most. The poet Alexander Tvardovsky, himself a veteran of the campaign, wrote about the dead of Rzhev in verse that was censored and suppressed for decades. Declassified Russian archive material only began emerging in the 1990s, 50 years after the last soldier died there, slowly reconstructing a battle that an entire government had worked to unmake. The Rzhev salient was eventually abandoned by the Germans in March 1943, a tactical withdrawal that Soviet propaganda reframed as a great liberation. The men who died in the 16 months preceding that withdrawal received no such reframing. They received silence, which is what governments offer when the truth is too expensive to acknowledge and the dead are too numerous to honor without also explaining who sent them forward. Number 7. The encirclement. Nobody counted. In July 1944, the German Third Army Corps, approximately 60,000 men, was encircled near the town of Brody in western Ukraine during the Soviet Lvov-Sandomiersk offensive. The encirclement was total. Within 10 days, the pocket had been destroyed. Fewer than 5,000 men escaped the ring. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the Soviet First Ukrainian Front that sealed the trap, and by any measure the destruction of the Third Corps ranks among the most complete annihilations of a German formation in the entire war. The Lvov-Sandomiersk offensive launched on July 13, 1944, as part of the broader Soviet summer campaign that was simultaneously dismantling Army Group Center further north. Brody sat at the junction of several German defensive lines, and the Third Corps found itself outflanked before its commanders fully understood the scale of the encirclement closing around them. The Soviet operation was methodical, coordinated, and devastating. German relief attempts failed to penetrate the ring, and by July 22nd, the pocket had ceased to exist as a fighting force. What complicated the historical record at Brody was not only the scale of German losses, but the presence of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, a formation recruited from Ukrainian volunteers and known as the Galicia Division. This unit fought inside the pocket and was largely destroyed. Its existence created a problem for every government with a stake in the post-war narrative. The Soviets preferred to suppress detailed accounting of their own operational losses. Western historians avoided the Ukrainian SS formation for reasons of political sensitivity. The result was a battle that suited no one's preferred story. Post-war historiography filed Brody under the general heading of the Lvov-Sandomierz operation, absorbed into a larger campaign narrative that emphasized the drive toward the Vistula rather than the specific destruction at the pocket. The annihilation of 55,000 German soldiers, one of the largest single battle losses the Wehrmacht sustained in 1944, received less scholarly attention than engagements a fraction of its size on the Western Front. The reasons were institutional, political, and, in retrospect, entirely deliberate. A battle that consumed an entire German corps and raised unresolved questions about collaboration, resistance, and national identity was quietly filed under other headings, and the men on both sides who died in the fields around Brody were left without a chapter of their own. Some erasures happen through active censorship. Others happen through the quieter mechanism of collective inconvenience, when the truth is too tangled to serve any single narrative cleanly, and so it is set aside and eventually forgotten. Number 6. The pocket that Stalin forgot to save. In November 1942, German forces in the city of Velikiye Luki, 400 kilometers south of Leningrad, were surrounded by Soviet troops as part of a winter offensive timed to coincide with the encirclement at Stalingrad. Hitler declared Velikiye Luki a fortress city and ordered its garrison to hold at all costs. The city's defenders, built around the German 83rd Infantry Division with approximately 7,000 men, began a siege that would last until January 1943. Velikiye Luki has been called the Little Stalingrad, and the parallel was not accidental. German High Command launched a relief attempt using LVT Panzer Corps, which drove to within 5 kilometers of the encircled garrison before Soviet forces halted it and pushed it back. Inside the pocket, supplies ran out, casualties mounted, and the temperature dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting the city be held as a symbol. The men inside paid for that symbol with their lives. The final Soviet assault overwhelmed the garrison on January 16, 1943. A small group of Germans attempted a breakout on January 14th, and some hundreds reached German lines, but the majority of the defenders were killed or captured. The timing of the battle created its own form of erasure. Stalingrad dominated every headline, every strategic analysis, every page of every newspaper on both sides. Velikiye Luki, unfolding simultaneously, was treated as a sideshow, a smaller proof of a larger thesis about Hitler's fortress doctrine that nobody needed to examine independently. The Germans suppressed detailed analysis of Velikiye Luki because it demonstrated the lethality of Hitler's refusal to permit tactical retreats, a pattern the German army's leadership was not yet willing to document publicly. Soviet records, meanwhile, noted the battle briefly before redirecting all attention to the Stalingrad narrative, which served Stalin's requirement for a singular, defining victory story. The broader operational losses suffered by Soviet forces in the relief prevention fighting around Velikiye Luki were similarly not subjects for detailed public accounting. When two catastrophes unfold simultaneously within the same war, history tends to choose one and file the other. The choice at Velikiye Luki was never random. Stalingrad was larger, more dramatic, and more useful to both sides as a defining moment, while Velikiye Luki exposed the same strategic failures in a form too small to be heroic and too painful to be acknowledged, which made silence the only outcome both sides could agree on. Number 5. The breakout. They rewrote twice. In January 1944, two German corps, approximately 60,000 men drawn from the 1 and 3 Corps of Army Group South, were encircled near the Dnieper River at Korsun-Cherkassy in central Ukraine. The Soviet forces closing the ring were commanded by General Ivan Konev. The German relief attempt was planned and partially executed by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Both sides subsequently claimed victory. Both sides were falsifying the record. The Korsun-Cherkassy pocket formed on January 28, 1944, as Soviet armored forces from the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts linked up west of the encircled German positions. Manstein launched a relief operation with the 3rd Panzer Corps, which drove toward the pocket through difficult terrain and deteriorating weather. By early February, the relief force had advanced to within 12 kilometers of the encircled troops, but Soviet resistance prevented it from breaking through. Inside the pocket, the situation became desperate. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were exhausted. The breakout came on the night of February 16 to 17, 1944. The encircled troops abandoned their heavy equipment and moved on foot through a blizzard toward the German lines. Soviet forces, including cavalry units, intercepted the columns in open ground. The scenes that followed were harrowing. Thousands of German soldiers were cut down in the snow within hours of the perimeter. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 men escaped the pocket, but the numbers of those killed during the breakout itself remain contested, with figures ranging from 18,000 to over 20,000 dead in a matter of days. German High Command declared Korsun a successful rescue operation, a triumph of German military resilience. Stalin's propaganda apparatus declared it a complete Soviet victory and the total destruction of the encircled force. Neither account was accurate, and both were enforced. The specific horror of the breakout night, thousands of men dying in open fields under cavalry assault, was documented by survivors in memoirs and post-war testimonies, but appeared in no official history from either government for years after the war ended. 2 governments, 2 propaganda machines, 1 battlefield, and the men who died in the snow between them were erased from both accounts simultaneously. Too inconvenient for German victory narratives and too numerous for Soviet annihilation claims. It is the particular cruelty of this battle that the dead were denied, even the dignity of an accurate count. Their numbers adjusted upward or downward depending on which version of events their killers and commanders found more useful. Number 4. America's longest and most expensive mistake. From September 19, 1944 to February 10, 1945, American forces fought a grinding, attritional campaign through 140 square kilometers of dense forest along the Belgian-German border near the city of Aachen. By the time the Huertgen Forest campaign concluded, the U.S. Army had suffered approximately 33,000 combat casualties, with an additional 9,000 men lost to trench foot, hypothermia, and psychological collapse. It was the longest battle the United States Army fought on German soil. It gained almost nothing. General Courtney Hodges commanded the U.S. First Army during the Huertgen operation, pushing division after division into terrain that systematically negated American advantages in armor, air power, and artillery. The forest was so dense that shells detonated in the tree canopy rather than on the ground, sending lethal splinters downward into troops below. German defenders from the 7th Army had prepared the forest meticulously, with interlocking fields of fire, bunker networks, and minefields that turned every advance into a catastrophic and methodical attrition of American manpower. Among the soldiers who fought at Huertgen was Private J.D. Salinger of the 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, later the author of The Catcher in the Rye. Ernest Hemingway was present as a war correspondent during portions of the fighting. Neither man's subsequent accounts dwelt extensively on the operational failure that defined the campaign. The battle consumed 9 American divisions sequentially, each one ground down and replaced, in an offensive that post-war military analysis identified as strategically unnecessary and tactically disastrous. The U.S. Army's official post-war histories acknowledged Huertgen but structured the narrative around what followed: the crossing of the Rhine and the final collapse of German resistance, rather than what was lost in the forest. This was not censorship in the Soviet sense. There were no classified files, no suppressed memoirs, no forbidden conversations. It was something more sophisticated: the careful selection of which chapter the story begins on, ensuring that the losses at Huertgen were absorbed into a larger victory narrative where they became the price of triumph rather than the evidence of avoidable failure. When a democratic government buries its military failures not through classification, but through narrative architecture, emphasizing the victories that followed rather than accounting for the decisions that preceded them, it is worth asking whether that silence is any less deliberate than the silence enforced by a totalitarian state. The forest does not care about the distinction. The 33,000 casualties of Huertgen were equally unacknowledged regardless of the method used to ensure that nobody looked too closely at how they were spent. Number 3. The pass paved with political promises. On September 8, 1944, Soviet and Czechoslovak forces launched an offensive through the Dukla Pass in the Carpathian Mountains, on the border between occupied Slovakia and German-controlled Poland. The stated objective was to breach the Carpathians and reach Slovak partisans who had risen against the Nazi occupation in the Slovak National Uprising, which had begun on August 29th. The pass was finally taken in late November. The uprising had been crushed by German forces on October 27th, 3 weeks before the pass fell. The 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps fought alongside the Soviet 38th Army through terrain that was unforgiving in every sense. The Carpathian passes were narrow, heavily defended, and offered almost no room for the flanking maneuvers that might have reduced casualties. German forces had fortified the approaches with characteristic thoroughness. The Czechoslovak and Soviet troops attacked into prepared positions across ravines and forested slopes, suffering losses that accumulated with relentless consistency across nearly 3 months of fighting in increasingly deteriorating autumn weather. By the time the Dukla Pass was secured in late November 1944, Soviet and Czechoslovak forces had sustained approximately 85,000 killed and wounded in under 3 months on a front measured in kilometers rather than hundreds of kilometers. The men they had fought to rescue were already dead or dispersed. The uprising that had prompted the entire operation had been suppressed, its leaders executed or sent to concentration camps, while the relief column was still fighting through the foothills. The strategic objective of the Dukla offensive had ceased to exist before the offensive achieved it. The post-war Czechoslovak communist government faced a dilemma with Dukla that it resolved through a form of suppression more sophisticated than silence. September 6th was declared a state memorial day. Monuments were constructed. The battle was incorporated into the founding mythology of socialist Czechoslovakia as proof of Soviet-Czechoslovak brotherhood forged in shared sacrifice. Every official account emphasized the heroism of the soldiers. None of the official accounts examined whether those soldiers had been sent to die for a strategic objective that was already lost when they were ordered forward. They built monuments to the men who died at Dukla Pass, established a public holiday in their honor, and wrote the operational failure out of every plaque and commemorative text. This is not remembrance. It is a second erasure, more refined than the first, dressed in bronze and political language, conscripting the dead into a story they did not live long enough to dispute. Of all the silences in this list, the silence at Dukla is perhaps the most cynical, because it was performed in the name of memory itself. Number 2. The battle that saved a nation. No one was watching. In the summer of 1944, Finland fought the largest battle in Nordic military history, and won. Between June 25th and July 9th, 1944, Finnish forces repelled a massive Soviet offensive in the Karelian Isthmus, preventing a Soviet conquest that would have ended Finnish sovereignty. The battle, centered on the village of Tali-Ihantala in southeastern Finland, involved approximately 50,000 Finnish defenders against an estimated 150,000 Soviet troops, supported by 800 tanks and over 1,000 aircraft. Almost no one in the Western world has heard of it. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim commanded Finnish forces during the defensive battle, coordinating a fighting withdrawal followed by a concentrated counterattack that stabilized the front and halted the Soviet advance. The scale of the Soviet assault in June 1944 was designed to knock Finland out of the war permanently. It was the largest offensive the Red Army had mounted against Finland, and it was supported by firepower that dwarfed anything Finnish forces had faced in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. Finnish casualties reached approximately 8,500 killed. Soviet losses are estimated between 18,000 and 22,000 dead. Tali-Ihantala occurred during the same weeks that Allied forces were consolidating the Normandy beachhead following D-Day, June 6, 1944. Every correspondent, every editorial board, every radio broadcast in the Western world was focused on France. A desperate defensive battle in southeastern Finland, fought by a nation the Western Allies regarded with deep ambivalence due to its co-belligerent relationship with Nazi Germany, received no meaningful coverage. It was invisible to the world at the moment it was happening, which meant it arrived at the post-war period without the foundation of contemporary documentation that other battles carried. What followed was a suppression embedded directly into international law. The Paris Peace Treaty of 1947, which formalized Finland's post-war settlement with the Soviet Union, imposed constraints that effectively prohibited Finland from publicizing military victories over Soviet forces. Article 9 restricted Finnish armed forces. The broader diplomatic reality made any Finnish celebration of battlefield success against the Red Army politically untenable. The nation that had fought hardest for its own survival was forbidden, by the terms of peace, from saying so in any meaningful public forum for decades afterward. Tali-Ihantala was erased not by a propaganda ministry, not by a classified archive, not by the quiet omission of inconvenient chapters, but by the terms of peace itself, a clause written into international law to appease a superpower, ensuring that the most consequential defensive victory in Nordic history would remain unknown to the world that the men of the Karelian Isthmus had fought to remain part of. That is a category of suppression without parallel in this list, and it is not the worst one. Number 1. The forgotten killing ground of Eastern Europe. In October 1944, one of the largest armored engagements of the Second World War erupted across the Hungarian Great Plain near the city of Debrecen. Between October 6th and October 29th, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Soviet Second Ukrainian Front clashed with German army groups south and Hungarian forces across hundreds of square kilometers of open terrain, committing an estimated 600 to 700 Soviet tanks and assault guns in a battle that involved more armor than many engagements celebrated in Western histories of the war. It has been almost entirely erased from them. The operation was conceived as a Soviet thrust to encircle and destroy German and Hungarian forces in eastern Hungary before they could withdraw behind the Tisza River. The Third Panzer Corps formed the core of the German armored response, launching counterattacks that temporarily encircled Soviet spearheads and created a fluid, ferocious engagement that shifted across the plain for 3 weeks without a stable front line. The Hungarian plain offered no natural defensive barriers, meaning that both sides committed to a grinding, attritional mobile battle of a kind that the Eastern Front had been producing since 1941, invisible to Western observers focused on the Rhine. Soviet casualties at Debrecen are estimated at between 30,000 and 40,000 killed, with total losses including wounded and destroyed equipment substantially higher. Those figures are estimates because the Soviet records for this operation are among the least accessible in the Russian military archive. The battle ended in a Soviet operational victory that opened the road to Budapest, which meant that Debrecen was immediately absorbed into the narrative of the Budapest campaign that followed. Its independent scale and cost dissolved into the larger operations accounting. It ceased to exist as a discrete event almost before the last shots were fired. 3 separate historical silences buried Debrecen simultaneously, and for entirely different reasons. Soviet operational histories subordinated the battle to the Budapest campaign, which offered a more dramatic and politically resonant conclusion. Hungarian communist historiography, constrained by Soviet oversight, could not examine the war on Hungarian soil with any independence. Western historians and correspondents in October 1944 were consumed by the Ardennes buildup, the liberation of France, and the crossing of the Rhine, and never turned their attention to the killing ground east of the Tisza. Each silence was independent. Together, They were total. The men who died at Debrecen, Soviet tankmen and German panzer crews and Hungarian infantrymen ground into the autumn soil of the Great Plain, deserved a chapter. By any measure of scale, duration, and consequence, the battle earned its place in the standard histories of the Second World War. It did not receive one. It received instead a few minutes in a video, watched by people who will move on to the next thing, which may be the only form of memorial the forgotten ever get, and which tells us less about those battles than it tells us about ourselves. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.